We're going to be talking about love all month, and we begin with one of the hardest parts of love that there is, this idea of love your enemies. You know, an Oklahoma State football fan was at the Fiesta Bowl last month for the Fiesta Bowl, and it was actually seated right next to one of the Stanford professors. They were playing Stanford, and the OSU fan tried to strike up a little casual conversation. He said, "Where are you from?" And the college professor smugly answered, "Well, where I'm from, we don't end a sentence with a preposition." So the man said, "Okay, where are you from, jerk?" Now, how do you deal with difficult people? We all know them. You can't escape them, right? The bully, the angry boss, the arrogant coworker, maybe an ex-spouse or lover, or a family member sometimes, or your homophobic neighbor, or the racist uncle, the self-righteous fundamentalist who tells you that you're going to hell, or worse, tells your children that they're going to hell. How do you deal with adversarial, oppositional, difficult people in your life? As the song goes, how do you love those who never will love you, who are so hard to love? Do you try to ignore them? Because that is usually just perpetuates the problem, right? Just kicks the can down the road a little bit, but it usually comes back. Maybe you make nice. Do you make nice with people like that? Because that usually is only a very short-term solution to the problem. Or do you just leave? Just take off? Because that is usually very disruptive and is really only for those times when there's absolutely no other choice and there's no way things are going to change. And then it is what has to happen, but it's very disruptive for everybody and not the first choice. Or do you get even? Be honest now. Because that feels good initially, but usually ends up sabotaging your relationships down the line. Right? In our reading from the Gospel of Luke chapter 6, Jesus says, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you." He goes on, if someone slaps you on one cheek, then just give them a pop in the nose, right? No, it doesn't say that, right? He says if somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Let them slap that cheek also. If you love those who love you, what credit is that? Everybody loves those who love them. That's easy. But love your enemies, it says. Do good to them. Now, these teachings from Jesus seem absolutely impossible. Right? They're so unrealistic. You have to wonder. A lot of people just discount them. They just say, "Oh, you know, that's just in the Bible." Now, prior to his saying this, the law was an eye for an eye. But he tells us, don't return evil with evil. Don't return hatred with hatred. If someone hurts you, don't hurt them in return. But maybe Jesus didn't understand what it's like when someone cuts you down, when somebody tries to hurt your business, destroy your marriage, ruin your family. Love and bless them? Really? Really? Listen to this. It was on this day, February 5th, 1869, when Minnie Cox was born. She was the first African-American female postmaster in the United States. She began her career as a teacher in a colored public school in Indianola, Mississippi, and in 1891, at the age of 22, President Harrison appointed Cox the postmistress of Indianola. And then President McKinley renewed her appointment while also elevating her status by giving her a full 4-year term. Now, however, this was a time in the history of this country when there was a backlash that had arisen against Reconstruction. The strides that black individuals and communities were making after the Civil War were being overturned. Angry whites were organizing and strategizing to regain control. This included moves to create voting disenfranchisement and major concerted efforts to remove all African Americans from public offices. In 1902, merely 19 years before the Tulsa race riot massacre here in this city, Cox became the focus of this reactionary movement. Whites in Indianola delivered a petition demanding Cox's resignation. When she refused, mobs formed and they threatened her with physical violence. The mayor and the sheriff declined to protect her, and she eventually resigned as postmaster and left town for a while. Now, this was happening all over the country at the time. African Americans were being threatened, lynched, and beaten. Not because of anything they'd done, but simply because of who they are. Now, at that point, America, for African Americans, for 300 years was unsafe. They were unprotected, subject to random acts of violence, and hated simply for being who you are. My professor Cornel West says, and it's not pretty language, it's strong language, he's known for that. He says, this is how you niggerize a people. You try to convince them not just that they're less than you, not just that you want to exploit their labor. You want to convince them that they are so afraid and scared that they don't even want to speak the truth. You try to make them feel hopeless and helpless, and therefore they are deferential to your status quo. He says, and I don't even want to say the word again, but that's how you N-wordize people. He goes on, the British tried to do it to the Irish. The Japanese tried to do it to the Koreans. America has been very ingenious in doing it to African Americans. It began as a form of social death, slavery. Then civic death, Jim Crow and Jane Crow. And then psychic death, self-hatred, self-flagellation, self-destruction, which leads eventually to spiritual death, nihilism, meaninglessness. Dr. West tells a story that after 9/11, when suddenly all Americans felt unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who they are, a white student comes in to his office one day. He's like, Professor West, I just can't get over this sense of being hated so. And he explains, that's what it's been like to be black in America for the last 400 years. Unsafe, unprotected, and subject to random violence and hated for who you are. Just ask any black parent who's trying to explain to their black child at 4 years old why they're being treated differently. His point is not to drudge up hard feelings or to have us dwell in the past, but to show how African Americans are a people who, in the midst of the great American democratic experiment, have been on intimate terms with terrorism. And we all have something to learn from how African Americans have historically and continually dealt with terrorism. What did Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. say in his eulogy after 4 black girls were killed in the bombing in Birmingham at the 6th Street Baptist Church? Victims of American terrorism? Somehow he was able, in the face of such hatred, to muster the spirit to promote love and justice. Look at Emmett Till's mother and how she responded when her child was a victim of American terrorism. When her 14-year-old black teenager from Chicago was brutally beaten and killed in Mississippi on his summer vacation for having the audacity to have a conversation with a 21-year-old married white woman out in public. And this is not an ancient story. This is around 1960. This is still in the lifetime of many of us here. And on a hot day in August, at the Robert Temple Church of God in Christ on the south side of Chicago, they had a funeral for her only child. And all the officials told her to keep the casket closed. But she said, no, we're going to keep it open. We're going to let the world see what Jim Crow looks like. Magazines came and took pictures. Tens of thousands of people came to the funeral. And when she stepped onto the chancel to speak, she looked over at her baby with his head all bashed and bloated many times its ordinary size. And what did she say? I have no time to hate, and I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. That has been the dominant black response to terrorism. There's never been a black intifada in America. How is it that people are terrorized for 400 years and have never engaged in counter-terroristic response? Love your enemies? Is it possible? Is it credible? Can it be done? How is it that there's never been a black Al-Qaeda in America? If black people had responded to American terrorism in that way, we would likely not have an American democracy right now. Instead of terrorists, African Americans kept producing Frederick Douglasses, Sojourner Truths, Martin Luther Kings, and Fannie Lou Hamers. And so many nameless and anonymous people who were terrorized, but who decided not to stoop down into the sewers of violence or to perpetuate hatred in response to hatred, evil in response to evil. These are folks who would rather lose and be right than win and become like those who persecuted them. That's an incredible story, y'all. Now, I know there will be someone who will come through the line after the service and say, but Marlin, what about the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers? Now, there's a lot that we could say and could be said about both of those groups, and they're different, and they have different ideologies, and we may not agree with parts or much of some of their ideology, but neither one of these groups ever once committed any organized acts of violence. You might say, but they looked and they talked like they were gonna. They never did. And it's wrong to confuse their hatred of white supremacy and their willingness to organize for self-defense when not being protected. It's just plain wrong to confuse that with any actual acts of organized, politicized violence of innocent people, right? Which never happened. That's what caused someone to say, you know, when you see an African American walking around, just stand up and give him a standing ovation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You could have gone underground and terrorized this country, but you didn't. Jesus said, love your enemies. Does it make any sense? Can anyone actually live up to that? Now, in the month of February, when we celebrate Black history in this country, we need to remember that we are talking about the achievements of people whose humanity has been radically called into question. And that can help us to be clear about the phenomenal nature of the accomplishments. The 20th century has been called by Henry Louis Gates and others the African American century. It began merely 30 years after the end of slavery. And here we are, at the dawn of the 21st century. By contrast, we can't even imagine now a truly American culture that has not been affected in profound ways and shaped by the contributions of African Americans. He says, when we listen to that century, there would be no Louis Armstrong, no Duke Ellington, no Billie Holiday, no Coltrane. In fact, there would be no jazz, no blues, no rock and roll. When we read this century, there would be no Ralph Ellison, no James Baldwin, no Toni Morrison or Alice Walker. When we think about what democracy means in such a century, there would be no W.E.B. Du Bois, no Thurgood Marshall, no Martin Luther King Jr. When we rent the movies of that century, there would be no Bojangles Robinson, no Sidney Poitier, no Spike Lee, no Denzel Washington. When we reminisce about the sports heroes of that century, there would be no Jesse Owens, no Jackie Robinson or Aletha Gibson, no Muhammad Ali, no Tiger Woods, no Venus Williams, no Michael Jordan. When we laugh about that century, there would be no Bill Cosby, no Richard Pryor. Imagine no Oprah. Come on now. No Arthur Ashe, no Michael Jackson. In every important field, from academia to athletics, from science to sports, from politics and entertainment to philosophy to philanthropy, the scope of this tremendous achievement in the face of overwhelming obstacles is almost unimaginable if it wasn't so completely palpable. A big question is whether we will continue to be afraid to talk about the shadow side of American democracy, or whether we will see that the conversation about race in the American democratic experiment is exactly what is necessary to reach American maturity. Remember that in Indianola, Mississippi, the African-American century began with the harassment of Minnie Cox, the first black female postmaster. The threats and organized political action was so intense throughout 1902 that in 1903 she finally tendered her resignation. But the new president, Theodore Roosevelt, would have none of it. Roosevelt, you may recall, worked to improve relations with African Americans. He famously invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. Now, many blacks had built the White House. They'd maintained and cooked at the White House, but none before had ever sat at the dinner table as a guest of the president. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was criticized harshly in many newspapers around the country, not only for his relationship with Booker T. Washington, but for refusing Minnie Cox's resignation. You know what he did? Roosevelt moved the Indianola post office and rerouted all mail to Greenville, Mississippi, 25 miles away. If people wanted to get their mail, until they accepted her appointment, and it took a while, even with that. This was major front page news at the time around this country, and the situation was eventually debated on the floor of the United States Senate, and Roosevelt stuck to his guns. He said unless Cox's detractors could prove that there was a reason for her dismissal besides the color of her skin, she would remain the postmaster. They could not prove any other reason because there was no other reason. Nevertheless, in 1904, when her term was up, she finally resigned and recommended a white person for the post. How do we love those who never will love us? How do we respond when people are threatening us verbally and physically? When they are threatening our job, our family, our peace of mind? Not by fighting evil with evil, As Martin Luther King said, you can't stop hatred with hatred. Only love can do that. When he and Gandhi both led their nonviolent protests, they explained to their followers, if we march with hatred in our hearts and on our faces and with violence, then the opposition will feel very justified in hitting us and hurting us. But if we walk peacefully towards them and their batons and their fire hoses and their dogs with love in our heart and peace, and they hit us down and they beat us and we stand back up with love on our face and they hit us down again, everyone in the world will see who's in the wrong. And those soldiers and police officers doing the beating were going to have to go home and tuck their kids in at night and know that they spent the day beating down peaceful, loving people. And that's how love transforms hatred. And it's not a sign of weakness. Peaceful resistance takes incredible courage and strength to walk into the face of that kind of violence, unarmed, unassuming. Now, there are a lot of books you can buy out there on how to deal with difficult people, and they'll give you various techniques for how to return an insult with a retort of one kind or another, or how to deal with problems in the workplace or at home or in different environments. But there is no technique to learning how to love. Right? That involves learning how to open your heart, and it is a life's work. And it's rooted in the idea that we do not let anyone else's behavior dictate ours. It's about remembering who you are, and even in the face of insult and attack, and never letting anybody cause you to lower yourself to their level. Remember, Jesus said, love your enemies. He didn't say like them. Thank God. Right? There's a lot of people we're not going to be able to like in this world. That's not the bar that we need to reach. It's to love people, to know that they too have a spark of God in them, no matter how covered up, covered over, and hidden. Remembering they too have the spark of the divine in them and trying to love it out of them. And even, as he says, to bless them. Now, it could be a blessing like, God, please give this person another job. It could be, it could be a raise. I don't care. Get them out of my division, out of my office. Whatever it takes, bless them with all kinds of great things, but just get them out of my life, right? That's all right. That's a blessing. Right? It could be to help this person understand that her actions are harming her as much as everyone else. Right? Ruby Bridges was the little 6-year-old African-American girl in New Orleans in 1960 who had to be escorted into her elementary school by National Guards through a gauntlet of angry, screaming, spitting, threatening white parents. The country sat in amazement when they watched this small child maintain her dignity through it all, every day, walking through that line of angry people, angry at her, calling her names, threatened to poison her. That's how the National Guard got involved. One day, someone noticed that each morning, when Ruby Bridges got to the top of the school steps after she walked all the way through that screaming angry mob, and she turned at the top of the stairs and she just looked over at the jeering crowd for a few seconds every day. And when asked what she was doing, she said she was saying a prayer for them because she knew they were in so much pain and ignorance. If 6-year-old Ruby Bridges can do it, in the face of that madness, then we know the answer to the question of whether the commandment to love our enemies applies to us. It applies to us. May this not be another African American century. May it be an American century. A century in which, in the face of global terrorism, we can together bless this world with a love that passes understanding. A century that lives up to the words of the old anthem, lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who has led us thus far on our way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever on the path, we pray. Love your enemies. Bless them. Is it possible? It's possible. Oh yes, it's possible. Amen.